Hi, welcome to Talking Books and Stuff, the program that talks all about books and writing and stuff. Here's your host, Dennis Rimmer.
And welcome back to Talking Books and Writing and Stuff. I'm Dennis Rimmer. Today we have with us Ken Cuthbertson. He's on the line with us from somewhere in Ontario. We won't give away his exact location, but the book we're going to discuss is 1945, the year that made modern Canada. And Ken Cuthbertson, I guess obviously the obvious question is, why did you select this year as a study?
Well, gee, Dennis, how long? By the way, thank you for inviting me to be on. I really appreciate it. How long have you got in terms of talking about this? I could go on for hours. 1945. Where do I begin? Well, obviously, because it was this is the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, and it's kind of a watershed in many ways, just as 1945 was for Canada, because this year there were 1.1 million Canadians who were in the military during World War II, men and women, and now there are about 30,000 of them left. So the ranks are thinning dramatically. So this was really, or will be the last. Remembrance Day was the last big anniversary of the end of the war. So it's kind of a changing of the guards. Just as I said, 1945 was a watershed year for Canada. That was one reason that I wanted to write this book, but also because for myself, and I guess for just about every baby boomer, babies who were born between 45 and what I think it was 65. That's a 20-year stretch, and there are a lot of us. We were raised and we grew up and in the shadow of World War II. Even though we were born after the war. In my own case, my father was a veteran. His two brothers were veterans, and just about everybody who came to the house to visit my father and my parents, they were in the war as well. And I grew up in a house that was built just after the war, in one of the veterans' mortgage programs. My parents paid, get this, $10 for their lot, and I think the house was $5,000. So every month, my mother would send off the mortgage check of $25. This was in the north end of Kingston, Ontario, near historic Inner Harbor. But and the house is still there. I was bathed in World War II lore and in the shadow of World War II from the time I was a child. So.
Yes, Ken Cuthbertson is with us here today. We're talking about 1945, the year that made modern Canada. So when I think back, I'm same generation as you, born in 1949. Yep. My parents met during the war. My dad was in the Air Force. And most of the visitors, like you pointed out, would have some kind of service connection, and that we had. And in fact, legend has it that my dad and a couple others were the guys who put together the Royal Canadian Legion branch out there in Crescent Beach, BC. So,
oh, really?
Yeah, I know of what you speak, but I'm thinking, again, what happened to us between 1945 and now? All I remember about 1945, well, I don't remember it.
You've heard about it, yeah.
Yeah, I've heard about it. The third largest navy in the world at the end of World War II. And like you said about the veterans, we probably don't give ourselves enough credit for what the country managed to pull off in the Second World War.
Oh, for sure. Prior to the war, this kind of intrigued me because when I started doing the research for my book, I thought I knew a fair amount about World War II. But as I started doing the research, I realized that I didn't know all that much about Canada's role in the war, nor did I know all that much about Canada prior to the war. We all didn't know about the Depression and all the rest of it, but Canada went through some very, very tough times in the 30s, obviously, like as did the States. But prior to the war, Canada was really an economic backwater. Even in the 1920s and into the 30s, Canada wasn't doing very well economically. It's not all that much has changed in some regards, because our economy then, as it is now, is very cyclical, because it's so much based on resources. The oil and gas sector agriculture, lumber, mining, all the rest of it. And that's what we exported. And in the 30s, of course, the Depression hit, and Canada was in dire straits. The war comes along, and suddenly the whole economy has to perk up because of the government spending and the military spending. So 1945 is really a transformative year in so many ways. I could get into that a little bit if you want me to. And we come out of the chute at the end of the war, transitioning from wartime economy to a peacetime economy, and Canada has really never looked back from those 75 years. We've had good times. Really, we've had some downturns, but basically we've been very prosperous, and compared to a lot of the countries in the world, we've done pretty darn well.
That's right. And 1945 to 1960-ish, is that
Yes.
kind of a good long stretch of good economic news for Canada?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And really, it continued on. We've had our ups and downs, but it continued on really until, we've had I think in the 90s, there was an economic downturn, and then in 2008, 2009 again. But, those were nothing really compared to the hardships that Canada endured in the 30s. And if you look at what happened in 45, as I said, there were a string of events. If you want me to just briefly touch on them, I can do that. But,
oh, yes, go ahead.
Well, 45, the war is coming to an end in April. Canadian troops liberate the Netherlands. The first Canadian army in Europe. And this is astounding if you stop and think about it. General Harry Creer, who's I knew his name prior to doing the research for my book, but I didn't really know much about him. Here was a guy who was really our Montgomery, our Eisenhower, led an army of over 350,000 men and women in the field, actually at the sharp end of the stick, fighting against the Germans. And they actually they routed the Germans in the Netherlands, and in May they accept the German surrender treaty there. Then we get in April. We got the United Nations conference, founding conference down in San Francisco, and Mackenzie King, who fancied himself as a great statesman, went down there with grand plans. And he kind of fell a little flat there, but because he wasn't given the due that he thought he was going to get. But Canada, nonetheless, emerged there as one of the leading middle powers in the world. Then we had VE Day on May 8th, and the biggest riots in Canadian history down in Halifax, which the Royal Canadian Navy men said that they were going to take the town apart after the war, and by God, they followed through on it, and it cost Admiral Leonard Murray, who was the head of the Canadian Navy down there and looked after all the convoys heading across the Atlantic. The only Canadian commander in 2 world wars to actually command a theater, an Allied theater, which is amazing. But he lost his job as a result of the Halifax riots. In July, of course, out come the baby bonus checks, which Mackenzie King championed as an initiative, hoping that he could win some veterans' votes and get reelected. And the government did get reelected, but King got bounced out. In his own riding out in Prince Albert, close to where you are.
Yep.
And he ended up having to run in a by-election to get his seat back. And in August, Canadian uranium fueled the little boy, the atomic bomb that the Americans dropped on Hiroshima, ended the war. And then in September, Igor Guzenko, the little cipher clerk, defected from the Soviet embassy in Ottawa, and that started the Cold War.
The Cold War, yes.
Yeah.
So we have all these watershed events, as you said.
Absolutely, yeah.
And keep the country rolling. Now, what did you find out in your research about 1945, the year that made modern Canada, the book out by Ken Cuthbertson? I'm thinking it must have been some kind of strange transformation, because you got all these people, men and women, who were in the armed forces and doing the heavy lifting in a lot of cases on land and sea, of course, with the corvettes escorting all the convoys, and then women going to work building bomb girls and flying airplanes and sending telegraphs and doing all that kind of stuff, making machine guns, and then suddenly they don't have a job anymore. They have to go become Little Miss Susie Housewife, and the guy who goes to work in an office is ordered around by some pencil-necked geek who never lifted a rifle in his life. How did the general population respond to this, again, an upheaval of what was going on for 6 years?
Well, they actually responded pretty well, but I'll say they responded well because Mackenzie King, who was how old was Mackenzie King? He was 70, I think 71 or so in 1945, and he'd been around a long time, and he was politically very astute. He was they called him Weird Willie because he was such an odd duck, but he was politically very astute. And he realized that the veterans, when they came back, were going to want their due. Because the veterans felt, well, we went off and fought for Canada, we fought for the Allies, we won this war, and we've given up a lot. We've given up, in some cases, some of the men were away for 5-6 years away from their homes, and as you know, 45,000 Canadians died in the war and didn't come back. But during the war, we saw how much of an effort Canada could put out. We punched well above our weight in terms of military might and in terms of the amount that we contributed to the Allied cause. And the light bulb came on, and Canadians realized, geez, if we can afford to fight in this kind of a war at this scale, our country can afford to give us a decent standard of living. So the veterans came back with the idea that the government owed them something. And King, Mackenzie King, who wanted to be reelected, recognized it. So he came out with a veterans package, which is really unparalleled in Canadian history. It had opportunities for veterans to go back to school, to university. It had these low-cost mortgages that I mentioned. My own father took advantage of, and as well all the social programs that were all bundled up. So that was really the heart of what transformed Canada in 45, and it was really because the veterans came back. They were expecting to be repaid, if you will, for their service, and Mackenzie King, being politically astute, decided that, and maybe he was a little frightened of them too. After all, you had 1 million people trained to use guns and whatnot, right. And they didn't like him because of the conscription issue here when he refused to introduce conscription. So Mackenzie King kind of looked after himself and looked after the Liberals, but it turned out well for Canada.
It certainly did. I'm not knocking it at all. 1945, the year that made modern Canada, by Ken Cuthbertson. And speaking of Mackenzie King, how would you rate him as a prime minister?
Well, as a human being, these days he would not get elected even to a city council or a township council. He was such a weird character. I mean, as I said, he was born in 1874. So in 1945 he was 71 years old, and he was a man well past his prime. He was, I hate to say this, but he was a racist. They look at MacDonald and have been tearing him down off the pedestal. Mackenzie King. I think in the latter part of the last century, 1998 or 1999, Canadian historians were polled, and they rated Mackenzie King as the greatest prime minister in Canadian history. I don't think they do that today because, as I said, he was a strange duck, and he was also overtly racist. His government was anti-Semitic, and at the end of the war, this is a little anecdote I'll tell you that really encapsulates King's view of the world, because when the atomic bomb was dropped, and he hears about it, he writes in his diary that he was glad that the atomic bomb was dropped on the Orientals and not on the white people of the world. So that kind of tells you who he is. He was a product of his time, and a very, very strange man, and he was an astute politician, an unparalleled backroom operator who could make the wheels of government turn, could create a political deal. But as a human being, he was Weird Willie, believe me.
Weird Willie, yes. I've heard about that. He communed with his dead mother all the time and things like that. Yeah,
and talked to his dog and, all the rest of it.
Well, I talk to my dog, too. So.
Well, I do, too, but not the same way he did.
Not the same way, no. Another point you bring up is Rocket Richard. I've been a Montreal Canadiens follower since probably 1958, 59.
Really?
When when Hockey Night in Canada used to come on halfway through the first period, or
on
remember
TV it well.
At the end, and they'd have Montreal one week and Toronto the next week, and I just started, I don't know why, paying attention to Montreal, and it's carried on ever since. But the Rocket sometimes gets a bad rap for not taking part in the war effort, and yet you point out some facts that probably some people have forgotten.
Yeah, I'm like you. I was as a kid, I loved hockey, and I used to listen on the radio because prior to it coming, I guess at the same time it was on television at halfway through the second period. It came out at 9:00. And I started watching hockey in the late 50s. Richard had retired by the time I really started watching. But there were during during the Depression, there were actually 10 teams in the NHL.
Oh yeah.
And they slowly died off. And by 45, by the war years, and certainly by 45, there were only the 6 teams. We call them now the original 6. And really, in Canada here, there were only 2 teams. There were the Canadiens, and there were the Leafs. And I didn't really like the Leafs. To be honest with you, I like Boston. Don't tell anyone, but I like Boston.
Okay.
But all we could get on our television on Saturday nights, there were one game a week, and it was one week it was Montreal was on, the other week it was Toronto.
Yep.
And I never really liked Montreal, and I hated Richard primarily because being young and silly, I listened to my father, who didn't like the French because he said, "Oh well, the French scuttled their fleet during the war, and the Quebecers didn't want to, were opposed to conscription." So he said the Frenchmen were cowards, and that Richard, God, that guy, and Richard was tarred and feathered, figuratively speaking, in my house, and certainly in the neighborhood. The kids that I went to school with. I started doing the research for my book, and I was prepared kind of to tar and feather Richard in print. And then I started reading about the guy, and I realized that he was not only was a loyal Canadian, he was no coward. He tried on at least 2 occasions to enlist, and because of hockey injuries, he was unable. They rejected him. It seems strange to me that a guy could play NHL hockey in those days, which was a rough and tumble sport.
Oh yeah.
Yet he wasn't fit to be in the military, and he was a polarizing figure in many ways, and he's still a demigod, a saint in Quebec to this day. Long after the guy's dead and gone, he's still regarded as being a saint, and with good reason. I could get into why he made headlines and what he was doing, but.
Yeah. But like you said in the book, it's, "Hey, Richard, 2 minutes for looking so good."
Yeah, with Grecian formula on his hair.
Something like that. I remember that. Yep.
So, Richard scored 50 goals in 50 games in 1945, and that kind of resonated with me because that was sort of what I'd heard about. But when I started digging into it and did the research, read all the old newspaper accounts and read some Richard biographies, he scored his 46th goal in 45 games, and that was considered to be the big to-do because Joe Malone, who was the previous record holder, I think he scored 45 goals in something like 25 games or something. So the record was an old one from dated 35, 40 years earlier. But Richard scores 46 goals in 45 games, and that's the big to-do. But then the question is, well, he's got a few more games left. Can he score 50 in 50? And in fact, he did. It was kind of almost a meaningless thing at the time. It didn't get headlines. It was the 46 in 45 that got the headlines. But Richard is remembered today for the 50 in 50, and that was really an event that, particularly in the United States, people paid attention to. This idea of scoring 50 goals in 50 games kind of had a resonance that appealed to people and that made headlines in the newspapers and things. But as I said, the 46 and 45 was the big thing here in Canada.
That's right. And, of course, talking of hockey some more, you bring in Foster Hewitt a lot as well.
Yes. Foster Hewitt, if there was a symbol of hockey in French Canada, it was Richard. If it was a symbol of hockey in English Canada, apart from the players, like Sil Apps was the big star for the Maple Leafs, but Foster Hewitt was the name that was known across the country simply because Foster Hewitt was the voice of the Maple Leafs on Saturday nights, and his hockey broadcasts were carried throughout English Canada on Saturday nights, and so he became synonymous with the game and started the whole notion of Hockey Night in Canada. In fact, his broadcasts on CBC were repackaged by CBC on the sports channels. Now they have these things where it'll be a Blue Jays game in 30 minutes or a hockey game in 30 minutes or whatever.
Right.
They shorten it down. They did the same thing with Foster Hewitt's hockey broadcasts in the 40s during the war, and the BBC broadcast them on the overseas network to Canadian servicemen and servicewomen. Even on the front, they would sit on Saturday nights if they could and tune into the broadcast.
A little bit of home on the Western Front, as it were.
Kidding.
Yeah, that's great. Also, I had a thought in my alleged mind here, and it disappeared. Speaking of the war, and the English influence was obviously a lot stronger then. Even I remember staying with my aunt and uncle in the mid '60s when the flag changed, and they were totally against that. Completely against that. So.
Sorry, I was going to mention something to you about that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, the Canadian flag, that was another thing that happened in '45. During the war, the Red Ensign became on an equal footing with the Union Jack. And in fact, when Canadians stormed ashore on D-Day, they did so under the Union Jack. And then they fought throughout the war under the Union Jack, also under the Red Ensign. And at the end of the war, because Mackenzie King was currying favor with the veterans, he wanted to put the Red Ensign atop the Parliament buildings, and he said it should be there on an equal footing with the Union Jack until such time as Canadians were able to come up with their own flag. And of course, it was another 20 years before we did, but
right.
It was a very controversial issue, yet King kind of sidestepped the issue, as he did with most things, and simply put the Red Ensign up on an equal footing with the Union Jack. And that was sort of weakened the tie, not sort of, it did weaken the ties further with the Brits.
And now, of course, it wouldn't, probably not still a great influence in our country, although we do have the, speech from the throne and all that kind of nifty stuff, which I still kind of admire. I don't know why, but it's...
And we're about to have a new free trade agreement with the Brits as well, because they've dropped out of Europe, the European economy,
Brexit or whatever.
Union.
Continuing on, we had war brides. That was a big, again, influence in the country.
Yes. But there were a couple 100,000 war brides that came over. Most of them were from the UK, where Canadians had been. Some Canadians had served at bases in the UK for several years, and others had met English girls when they were there passing through on the way to the front, that kind of thing. And then there were a lot of Dutch women. Because the Canadians were so heavily involved in the Netherlands, the Dutch women met Canadian men and came back over. So there are hundreds of thousands of them. Yet, when I started doing research for my book, I was looking around trying to find some. And my God, it was difficult because, like the veterans, any war brides now are in their late 80s or into their 90s. So the ones I could found and was able to talk to, some of them, of course, were no longer with it mentally enough to remember or to even be articulate enough to tell me about their experiences. So I had a lot of difficulty finding war brides. And one of the war brides that I did find was a lady who lived down in Stratford, Ontario. And I wasn't able to visit her because of the COVID thing, but I talked to her extensively on the phone, wrote her about her experiences. Her name is Gao, and she's in my book. And when the book came out, I wanted to send her a copy. And so I contacted her daughter because I wasn't able to reach the mother on the phone. And the daughter said, "Oh, I'm sorry. Mom was in the hospital and she died of COVID the other day." So that was kind of a poignant moment for me, a little sad because one of the last, and I did talk to a couple of other war brides. One in particular who is here in my hometown. She and her husband, who was a war vet, the woman, Barb Fitzel, her name is. Her husband is gravely ill now, so she's suffering the same sort of trauma that Mrs. Gao's daughter did. That mom and dad are passing away. Right.
Yeah, and I see more than a few times in our local obituaries the mention of so and so. Mom came over from England or. Yeah, usually England. Sometimes, I guess I have noticed some Netherlands or France, but
mostly the Netherlands.
Yeah, a couple more minutes here with Ken Cuthbertson, author of 1945, The Year That Made Modern Canada. So let's get on a bit of a more darker topic. Igor Guzenko, you're saying that character kind of was the catalyst for the Cold War with the Iron Curtain. So can you encapsulate the Guzenko situation in a few minutes?
Yeah. Guzenko comes over on a couple of years before in Ottawa because the Soviets suddenly became our friends during the war. As you know, Uncle Joe Stalin had a toothbrush mustache, and they called him Uncle Joe, and he was kind of a friendly, jovial character here. But of course, at home he was a murderous tyrant.
Yes.
But anyway, they had an embassy that originally was a legation in Ottawa, and then it becomes an embassy towards the end of the war. And Guzenko comes over as the cipher clerk. And a cipher clerk is the person who deciphers or encodes all of the messages that pass back and forth. So he's got his finger on the pulse of what the Russians are up to. And he has great knowledge of the Russian spying that's going on here, because the Russians saw Canada as an easy entree to the secrets of the Americans with their atomic bomb program. And, of course, Canada was involved in refining the uranium for the atomic bomb and whatnot. So Gouzenko knows about all the spying that's going on, and he becomes a little bit, I won't say disillusioned, but he becomes somewhat disillusioned with the Soviet system, but also, more importantly, is through a series of misunderstandings, he's ordered back to Moscow. And he thinks that if he goes back to Moscow, the way they're eliminating people who've been in the West or who are suspected of not being loyal to the regime, is going to be killed. So he gathers up, stuffs his jacket full of papers and secret cables, and he tries to defect. And when he comes out of the Soviet embassy, goes to defect, he goes to the Ottawa Journal newspaper in downtown Ottawa, and expects that he's going to be welcomed with open arms, and there's going to be the media is going to publicize his claim that the Soviets are spying, but they turn him away. And then the word comes out. He goes over and knocks on a few government doors, and word starts to get around that there's this guy who's defected from the Russian embassy. And Mackenzie King hears about this, and he begins to get really nervous, because he thinks, well, geez, if this comes out that we've got this Soviet spy here who's defected now, and he's got all these secrets, this is going to kill the relationship with Russia. So King says to his people, well, just send this guy back. Give him back to the Russians. We don't want him. But luckily for Gouzenko, William Stevenson, the Canadian who was the man called Intrepid,
yep.
He had close ties with the Canadian government, and he happened to be in Ottawa around the time that Gouzenko had defected, and he heard about it. And he said, under no circumstances hand Gouzenko back. This guy has got a wealth of information about the Russian spying in the United States and in Canada. And so he orders that he be put under protection, and Gouzenko is. And then he, of course, spills the beans, and that's really the start of the Cold War, because the Soviets are so embarrassed. They want to get this guy back, and they want to kill him, and they would have. But he was under a witness program type thing where they squirreled him away, and he testified against the Soviet spies here in Canada and in the States. So a fascinating character.
Fascinating story. And also you mentioned that he was amazed at all the food that was available in Canada.
Yeah, he had a pretty good life in Ottawa, and he and his wife, and in fact, if you're ever in downtown Ottawa, outside the apartment building where the Gouzenkos lived, there's actually a plaque. Can you believe that? A plaque in honor of Gouzenko. I got a picture of it in my book, but there was an Ottawa historian who was enamored with Gouzenko's story and led the fight to put a plaque there. And only in Canada, only in Canada where we have a spy, a foreign spy who gets his own plaque.
We're talking
Gouzenko, fascinating, by the way. After Gouzenko died, he died in the late 80s. His wife, Svetlana, appealed to the Russian government, to Putin, for a pardon so she could go back home. What do you think Putin said? No way. Yet.
I guess he would say, no thank you. Thanks, but no thanks.
Exactly. Yeah.
Ken Cuthbertson is with us today. The Year That Made Modern Canada, 1945, is the book. I understand you have a couple of other projects in the works that might be coming out soon.
Well, I started work on another book about a Canadian woman scientist. I won't say too much about it yet because it's bad luck if I talk about it. But that's a topic that intrigues me as well. I mentioned the war brides, and you mentioned the number of women who were involved in the war industries. Kind of an intriguing story in that we tend to think of World War II as being the gateway for a lot of women to break out of their roles as homemakers. But in fact, as you said, you pointed out, just as happened at the end of World War I, at the end of World War II, the boys came home, and it was expected that the ladies would go back to their homes and back to baking and having babies, and that's for the most part what most of them did. So it was a bit misleading to think that World War II was a great liberator for women, but it certainly did open a lot of people's eyes to the role that women could play in our economy. and in society.
Certainly did. This is Ken Cuthbertson, the book 1945, The Year That Made Modern Canada. So good luck with the new project, sir. And if I'm ever back in Kingston, if they lift all these restrictions, we'll probably give you a call and go for a coffee or something.
Or a beer.
Or a beer. Okay, thank you very much.
Well, my pleasure. Thanks very much, Dennis. I really appreciate you giving me the call.
Thank you for visiting with us today. This is Talking Books and Stuff with Dennis Rimmer. Contact him at dennis@talkingbooks.tk. Thank you, and may all the good news be yours. Oh, and don't forget to check out his book, The Great Canadian Notebook, available across Canada and at amazon.ca.